How proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Good morning and welcome to the University of Maine. I'm Eric Brucker, Dean of the College of Business, Public Policy, and Health. Today's lecture is the second in an annual series of lectures sponsored by the William S. Cohen Center for International Policy and Commerce. Our university established this center in 1997 upon receiving Bill Cohen's congressional papers. We remain most grateful for this generous gift. The Cohen Center is housed in the college I oversee. The center's mission, however, is to enhance the competitiveness of U.S. businesses, to foster understanding of international policy issues, and to accelerate the economic development of Maine and the nation. The center's focus on public service reflects the career emphasis of its namesake. In your programs, you will find cards for questions. If you wish to submit a question to Secretary Albright or Secretary Cohen, please write it on a card and pass the card to the end of your row. An usher will collect the cards, which will be read as time permits later in this morning's program. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the President of the University of Maine, Dr. Peter S. Hoff.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Brucker. On behalf of the students, faculty, and staff, welcome to the University of Maine. We are extremely pleased that today's event has attracted so much interest, a capacity crowd of almost 1,600 here at our fabulous Maine Center for the Arts, and an audience of thousands more watching on Maine Public Television here in Maine, as well as in parts of New Hampshire, Quebec, and the Maritime Provinces of Canada. As the state's flagship university, we are proud to offer you today's program, an opportunity to hear from two highly distinguished and respected world figures. But first, there are several people here today who deserve special recognition. We are pleased to have several members of Secretary Cohen's family here with us this morning, including his sister, Marlene Beckwith, and Secretary Cohen's son, Christopher Irish. I should add with some pride that last May, Chris graduated from the University of Maine with highest honors. Congratulations again, Chris. We're also joined by more than 24 members of the state legislature. We welcome you as well and thank you for your service to the state of Maine. Let me also recognize several leaders of our state university system, Chancellor Terrence McTaggart, our system trustees, the presidents of our system institutions, and our University of Maine Board of Visitors. Thank you all for joining us. And now, a few words about our opening speaker. During the last 40 years, our nation has been served extremely well by 4 Maine natives who have played prominent roles in national and international affairs: Ed Muskie, Margaret Chase Smith, George Mitchell, and William S. Cohen. Each has made lasting contributions to national well-being and to world order. Each has made us very proud. Here at the University of Maine, we have a special affinity for Bill Cohen, one based on more than just his political achievements. Our fondness to him extends beyond the fact that he grew up just a few miles from our campus. It's not just because he served the people of this area as an elected official, first as a city councilor, then as Bangor's mayor, then for more than 2 decades in Congress. It's not just because he taught at this university for 3 years prior to his election to Congress. And it's not just because we have a public policy center and a lecture series here named after him. No, we have a special fondness and admiration for Bill Cohen as a model of what this university strives to promote: a learned person, one focused on the world of ideas and actions, and one who contributes to both those worlds. And he contributes in many ways, as both a student of history and as a history maker, a lover of classical literature and an author of contemporary fiction, a highly skilled practitioner of poetry and prose, a global thinker whose thoughts nonetheless remain mindful of his hometown roots and values. Many people in today's audience see Bill Cohen as someone even more special to them, as a longtime friend and neighbor, someone who has brought pride to the state of Maine through his character and performance as a public figure. Last week, his successor in the U.S. Senate, Senator Susan Collins, shared some thoughts about Bill Cohen that illustrate the reputation he has earned both in Washington and in Maine. According to Senator Collins, many of her colleagues cite Bill Cohen's reputation for integrity, deliberation, and independence as the standard against which they measure all public servants. That's pretty high praise from the United States Senate, but we shouldn't be surprised. After all, for years, Bill Cohen has been a standard by which Maine people have measured other public servants. We still do. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm University of Maine welcome to the United States Secretary of Defense, the Honorable William S. Cohen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President Hoff. You can tell just by virtue of that glowing introduction that I have been elevated at least 4 or 5 inches up here on the podium. But thank you for your very generous and kind words, and also for the outstanding job that you're doing here at the university. Chancellor McTaggart, Dean Brucker, former President Fred Hutchinson, as indicated, my sister Marlene, her son and my nephew Mark, and one little person who's been left out of the introduction, my grandson Jacob. We have a bet going in terms of how long he'll be able to tolerate my infliction of a speech before he is carried out of the auditorium here today. And so many of my friends who are in the front row, I could take the rest of the morning just to acknowledge all of you who have been not only friends but supporters, political activists, sometimes even critics in the audience on the other side of the aisle, but always in a spirit of great generosity. And so I am delighted to be here. I am particularly happy that I could be here accompanied by the person I will introduce in just a few moments. I must say that I was a bit surprised when President Hoff told me the students have been looking forward to this week with great anticipation. because you may recall last year when I spoke at the forum, I noted that foreign policy often fails to stir the heartbeat of most college students. And then I was told, of course, the reason is it's opening of hockey season that really has captivated your attention. And I'm usually very cautious in making predictions, but there's one prediction I feel safe in making today, a repeat championship for the Black Bears. So. John Kennedy once remarked that history is the past rushing into the future, trying to hold fast is to be swept aside. In just last year, since I spoke here of the new dangers that lay ahead, we have indeed been swept up by a rushing tide of world events. Our armed forces have damaged Iraq's ability to build chemical and biological weapons in Operation Desert Fox. We also helped to raise up the lives that were shattered during Hurricane Mitch in Central America. We struck back at those terrorists who slaughtered hundreds at our embassies in Africa, and we're planning even more deadly attacks. We continue to stand with our friends in Asia as North Korea lobbed missiles over Japan. We saw dueling nuclear tests on the Indian subcontinent, and of course, last evening, we saw the Pakistani military take over the reins of government. In Kosovo, NATO turned back a brutality that frankly has not been seen in Europe since the end of World War II. In Washington, we gathered with our allies to celebrate a half century of progress and to chart the future of the history's most successful alliance, an alliance that embraced 3 former foes as new members. And as we gather here today, American men and women, many of them not much older than the students who are here today, they are serving the world over to preserve the peace and freedom that we all cherish. They are bringing security and stability to East Timor. They are keeping the peace in Bosnia and now in Kosovo. They are interdicting drugs in South America. They are clearing deadly landmines across Africa. They are training side by side with friends and allies on every continent. And indeed, this has been a time of profound engagement for our country and for the dedicated young men and women who are serving in our armed forces. And I know that there are a number who will raise the question about this leadership and say, should we really be doing so much? And indeed, I think that's the right question, because we can't either afford to be the world's police force, but we can't afford to be a prisoner of world events. And as a nation, we've got to make choices. As Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, behind every scheme to make the world over lies the question, what kind of a world do we want? And indeed, every action, and I would suggest every instance of inaction, has consequences for this country and around the world. The United States has chosen to act when our national interests and values compel action, and when American leadership, and only American leadership, is necessary to achieve a worthy goal. And indeed, we have to resist the temptation to use our forces in every dispute that catches our eye or our emotions. But we also have to recognize the truth that there are times not only when we can act, but when we absolutely must act. The United States is actively engaged in world affairs because it's profoundly in our interest to be engaged. There is no country that enjoys more rewards from the stability provided by global institutions. There is no country that sees greater returns from the prosperity generated by a free and open world economy. There is no country that reaps more security from our strategic alliances. And indeed, if we value the benefits of this global system, if we appreciate all that American leadership brings, then we have to embrace the duties of that leadership. And as Churchill said, responsibility is the price of greatness. Just last month, I was in Russia, and I witnessed in some stark relief the benefits of our engagement, and also the dangers that remain for us to be concerned about. I went to a once secret shipyard up in northern Russia, and there I saw with great satisfaction that the Russians were actually cutting apart some of those submarines that pose one of the greatest threats to our security. Typhoon submarines as large as 2 football fields were being cut down and dismantled. That was one of the benefits of the Nunn-Lugar program, whereby we're seeking to send to the scrap heap those instruments of war-making that threatened our security. So helping Russia to reduce its deadly arsenal is part of our mutual determination to move away from the Cold War's threat of mutual destruction. But also while I was in Moscow, I saw a darker glimpse of events. I saw, as I traveled the streets of downtown Moscow, I saw some buildings that had been bombed and burned out. They had been the victim of terrorist activities. In fact, while I was in Moscow, a bomb went off, killing some 90 people. And so I saw a city and a people in the grip of terror. It was a random act of terror, perhaps, but it may have been more premeditated than that. And we've seen the reaction on the part of the Russian government and the military to try to cut down the ability of those groups who are seeking to instill terror in the hearts and minds of the Russian people. It may be tempting to view these trials as the problems of a distant nation, far away from our daily concerns, just like the poison gas attack that took place in the subway in Tokyo a few years ago, just like the bombing of our embassies in Africa, just like the ongoing challenge of containing Saddam Hussein and his program to produce chemical or biological weapons. But those dangers are inching closer to our shores every day. And indeed, from Oklahoma City to New York City, the specter of terror has already touched us. And in truth, these horrors could have been much worse than they were. The Japanese cult had planned to use anthrax against American troops, and the criminals who bombed the World Trade Center were gathering the ingredients for a chemical weapon attack, hoping to kill not hundreds, but to kill thousands. And indeed, we exist today in what I would call a superpower paradox. We're the strongest nation on the face of the earth. We have a matchless military force that few would dare to challenge in battle on the field. But for every power that we possess, it invites our enemies to look for our Achilles heel. Not with troops coming across our borders, but with a vial of anthrax slipped through customs. And not with bombers sent over our cities, but with chemicals released beneath them. The United States is actively preparing to meet these threats, but we can and we must do more than simply respond. We have to continue to engage the world, shaping it to serve our interests. Now, last year I noted that we're approaching the end of what Henry Luce called the American century. And in that same essay, Luce wrote that other nations can survive simply because they've endured so long, sometimes with more significance and sometimes with less. But this nation, conceived in adventure and dedicated to the progress of man, this nation cannot truly endure unless there courses strongly through its veins from Maine to California, the blood of purpose and enterprise of high resolve. Now, these large challenges must be met by strong and wise leaders. And I believe that few individuals in the 20th century better illustrate the vital imperative for American engagement or the capricious world in which we live than the distinguished public servant that I have the pleasure of introducing you today. A friend, a colleague, an American whose life has been defined by action and activism. Madeleine Albright's life story, in so many ways, is the very story of freedom in our time. A child of Czechoslovakia, the daughter of a diplomat, her family fled the horrors of the Third Reich, returning when the guns fell silent, only to flee once again when the heavy sheet of Stalinism descended on her homeland. And by the time she was 11, she had lived in 5 countries and spoke 4 languages. But the trials of her youth, the great sacrifice of her principal parents, it would turn out to be a great gift for America. Because this young woman grew up to be a diplomat and a leader whose skills and strategic empathy served this nation every single day. And indeed, Madeleine Albright's deep understanding of the world from which she came, a world of strife and struggle, it's what guides American foreign policy today. And it's her ability to speak, I would say literally and figuratively, the language of those across the table that makes her so remarkably effective. I'm hesitant to say this, but I first knew Secretary Albright 25 years ago when she was serving as a staff member and advisor to Senator Muskie. We climbed aboard a P-3 out of Brunswick and flew to observe the 200-mile limit. And we rode on that plane for a long time looking for the 200-mile limit, and finally the pilot said, "We've just crossed it," and we turned around and came back. And we're told that the 200-mile limit is still there. And she and I are going to be stopping later today at a college in Lewiston, whose name shall remain undisclosed, to tour the Muskie archives. But I must say, I have stood with Secretary Albright in times of both great celebration and also great sorrow. In Madrid, we joined hands and we welcomed the 3 new nations, including that of her birth, into the NATO alliance. And then at Andrews Air Force Base, we mournfully welcomed home for the final time those who were struck down at our embassies in Africa. But to stand with this leader is to bear witness to her common decency and her uncommon determination. George Marshall, who was a predecessor to us both, he spoke of the deciding factor in decisive moments. He said, "It is the spirit that we bring to the fight." Madeleine Albright has, at every turn of the world stage, brought a strength and a spirit to fight for America's interests and values, from enlarging NATO to the ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the great struggle for peace, from the Middle East to the Balkans. But even more than those diplomatic accomplishments, Madeleine Albright has brought forth hope to millions of people because she really embodies the true promise of America. She understands what this country represents to the people of the world, and for so many around the globe, she carries with her the promise and the dream of a better world. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my great privilege and pleasure to serve with her in helping to lead this nation. It's now my honor to introduce my great and good friend, Secretary of State Madeleine K. Albright.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, my very dear friend Bill, thank you very much for that introduction and for welcoming me to your home. President Hoff, Chancellor McTaggart, Dean Brucker, former President Hutchinson, President Miller, faculty and students of the University of Maine, guests and friends, good morning. What a wonderful welcome. Thank you very, very much. I have long felt a kinship for Maine because of the years I spent working for Senator Ed Muskie, my first boss. He was a plain speaker who accomplished much and understood deeply the connections between American strength at home and our leadership overseas. Aside from my parents, he remains my greatest hero, and I look forward to going with Secretary Cohen later in this day to visit the Muskie archives. I'm also delighted to be invited to deliver the William Cohen Lecture. It is named for someone I deeply admire. For a quarter of a century, Bill Cohen has been one of America's most outstanding and respected public servants. While others have given their first allegiance to party or to some narrow ideology or even some special interest, Bill Cohen has devoted himself to Maine and to America. And you must be very proud of him, as I am, to serve with him. And let me say, I very much echo the words of the President here, who said that there is a great admiration and fondness. We really see each other every day. We talk on the phone. We cooperate on so many subjects. And he is a man of such incredible decency and love of country and joy in what he is doing that he is a pleasure to work with. And Bill, I thank you so much for your very kind introduction. I guess we started out pretty well. The 200-mile limit is there. But the great part about Bill Cohen, coming back from that trip, he was reading poetry. So that was the first time that I saw that part of him. And he really is I could go on a long time, but I do have some other things I have to say here. Another reason I'm pleased to be here is that I'm a former professor, and I love academic surroundings. And on the flight up, or I guess down to Maine, I was thinking about my own days in school. Even then, I was very interested in foreign policy, and every time I went to a new town or a new school, I would start an international relations club and name myself president. And because it's not only because of my insatiable appetite for power, but also because I became interested in foreign policy. And the truth is, I couldn't help it. Because when I was growing up, events overseas shaped almost everything about my life. I was still a toddler when the Nazis overran my native Czechoslovakia and plunged the world into global conflict. Later, the Holocaust shook our faith in humanity itself, and the dawn of the nuclear era called into question the very survival of our race. The Cold War divided the world into two well-armed camps, and periodic crises in Korea, Hungary, Berlin, Cuba, Prague, and Vietnam made us keenly aware of the dangers that existed and the responsibilities that we as Americans had. Today, all this may seem as relevant as a manual typewriter or a long-playing record. The Soviet Union no longer exists. We are the world's lone superpower. As a result, it may be tempting to look upon international affairs as just another academic subject, something to read about and debate, but not a determining factor in our lives. And that temptation exists not just for students, but for all of us. There is a grave danger in this, for it may be that we Americans have come to feel safer than we truly are. And that picks up on some of the points that Secretary Cohen made. And it's certainly true that if we were to become complacent and to take our security and prosperity and freedom for granted, we would endanger them all. We cannot simply assume that because the Cold War has ended, the dangers posed by weapons of mass destruction have disappeared, or that because free markets are ascendant, global prosperity is assured, or that because nations communicate more, they will fight less, or that because totalitarianism has been defeated in many places, it is gone everywhere and will not rise again. The world is shaped not by those who merely inherit, but by those who act. And if we discard the cloak of leadership, others who may not share our interests or values will surely pick it up. Earlier generations of Americans turned the tide in the First Global War, defeated the greatest evil the world has known, and defended freedom through decades of the Cold War. Our task is different and seemingly less dramatic, but no less important. It is to forge a steadily growing consensus based on steadily rising standards that will help bring nations on every continent closer together around basic principles of democracy and open market, the rule of law, and a commitment to peace. As a goal, that is as easy to say as it is difficult to achieve. Like freedom itself, it is something we will never fully achieve, but can only pursue. And if America is to lead the world in the right direction, as we must, we will have to make good use of every available foreign policy tool. That means our armed forces must remain the best led, the best trained, the best equipped, and most respected in the world. And as President Clinton has pledged, and Secretary Cohen and our military leaders assure, they will. But we will also need first-class diplomacy, because on many occasions we will rely on diplomacy as our first line of defense to cement alliances, build coalitions, and find ways to protect our interests without putting our fighting men and women at risk. At the same time, our diplomacy is stronger because we have the threat of force behind it. In this way, force and diplomacy complement each other. It's like having Pedro Martinez do your pitching and Mark McGuire or Sammy Sosa do bat cleanup. It is by combining force and diplomacy, for example, that we protect Americans from the threat posed by nuclear weapons. Here, the military deterrent provided by our armed forces and the technological edge they enjoy are indispensable. But we will all sleep better if our deterrent is never used. The diplomatic challenge is to create a political environment in which serious military threats to our country are less likely to arise. And that's why, since 1992, our support has helped deactivate almost 5,000 nuclear warheads in the former Soviet Union, eliminated nuclear weapons from 3 former Soviet republics, and purchased more than 60 tons of highly enriched uranium that could have been used by terrorists or outlaw states to build such arms. We're also helping 30,000 former Soviet weapons scientists find employment in peaceful commercial ventures, so they're not tempted to sell their expertise to those who might do us harm. We're taking steps as well to protect ourselves from the new threats posed by ballistic missiles. Here, the military job is to maintain our deterrent and develop the best defensive technology possible. The diplomatic job is to ensure that in responding to new dangers, we do not act rashly and aggravate or revive old ones. Finally, we have called upon the Senate to approve a treaty that would ban nuclear explosive tests of any size for any reason in any place for all time. As we speak, the outcome of the debate is still uncertain. The Senate could vote to delay consideration or not to approve American participation. The comprehensive test ban has been a goal of U.S. presidents since Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy. It promises to slow both the development and spread of new and more dangerous nuclear weapons. The treaty has been widely endorsed by our military and scientific leaders because it would make our nation more secure and our world safer. The United States today has no plans and no need to conduct nuclear explosive tests. It is plainly in our interest to discourage others from doing so as well. The treaty would do that by banning tests and establishing a global monitoring system to detect cheaters. However the Senate votes, the world should not doubt America's commitment to reducing the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. We will continue both to advance our program for assuring the reliability of our nuclear deterrent and to observe a moratorium on nuclear explosive tests. We will continue to support the international monitoring system the treaty would establish. We will persist in urging others to join the agreement and to refrain from tests prohibited by it, and surely there will be further discussion of the merits of the treaty here at home, because there's no question that this is a landmark pact which would serve both our national interests and the cause of world peace. A second example of where we use force and diplomacy to safeguard American security is by striving to reduce the risks posed by regional conflicts. Because the United States has unique capabilities and standing, it is natural that others will turn to us in time of emergency. In one sense, that's gratifying, but it also leads to difficult damned if you do, damned if you don't choices. American actions must reflect American interests. Neither our armed forces nor our prestige should be committed lightly. And when we decide on a course of action, we should not rest until our goals are achieved. You'll be pleased to know that Senator Cohen and I say approximately the same things. The question, of course, is when, where, and how America should engage. There is no mathematical formula for arriving at such judgments. Before launching a diplomatic initiative or considering the use of troops, a president must weigh our interests against a matrix of past commitments, present capabilities, future hopes, and enduring values. He or she must marry principle to pragmatism so that we are not only able to do the right thing, but also to do the thing right. The risks of action must be balanced against the risks of not acting, and America's stake must be reflected in the nature and extent of America's commitment. Taking all this into account, I believe Americans can be proud of the part we have played in supporting peacemakers over bomb throwers in key regions of the world. For example, President Clinton and another of Maine's extraordinary former senators, George Mitchell, have been deeply involved in efforts to end the century-long strife in Northern Ireland. In the Middle East, we have entered a new and more hopeful stage in the peace process. For the first time in years, Israelis and Palestinians are talking directly to each other, negotiating directly, and looking for creative ways to address each other's concerns. America will do all it can to support the parties in their pursuit of peace, and this is true not only between the Israelis and Palestinians, but also for the entire region. Daunting obstacles remain, but a just, lasting, and comprehensive Middle East peace is within our grasp. This is an opportunity leaders in the region must seize, for there could be no greater gift to the future. In East Timor, we are participating in a UN-authorized force led by Australia and Thailand to shield civilians from violence and allow them to shape their own destiny in accordance with the popular will. Secretary Cohen was in Indonesia last month, where he conveyed our message, which is firm but fair. We fully back Indonesia's efforts to strengthen its democracy, but we also expect the Indonesian armed forces to disarm militias in West Timor and prevent them from threatening the East. Too often during the past few months, those charged with preserving order have conspired with the enemies of order. That is a crime against the people of East Timor and unacceptable to the world. We're also working with leaders in Africa to end the numerous conflicts that have generated suffering and slowed progress on that continent. Next week, I will travel to Africa for the third time in my current job. I will make clear America's commitment to assist not by trying to impose solutions, but by supporting the implementation of African solutions and ideas. Finally, in Kosovo, we continue to meld force and diplomacy in a manner that serves U.S. interests while upholding values that we cherish. Southeast Europe has been a source of dangerous instability through much of this century. It is where World War I began. Battles in World War II were fought, and Europe's worst violence in 50 years occurred this decade. It would have been irresponsible and unconscionable if America and NATO had simply stood by when Slobodan Milosevic launched his ruthless campaign of ethnic cleansing. At the outset, we used diplomacy backed by the threat of force to deter Milosevic and achieve a peaceful settlement. When Belgrade chose instead to attack, we responded with force while working diplomatically to maintain Allied unity and explain NATO's intentions. Later, we used diplomacy to isolate Milosevic, enlist Russia on the side of peace, and gain Security Council support for an international peacekeeping force in Kosovo. And now, we're working jointly through military and civilian institutions to build peace, aid economic recovery, and lay the groundwork for democratic self-government. In recent weeks, we have heard some suggest that America need not concern itself when aggression or atrocities are committed overseas unless they are directly committed against us. Now, obviously, we neither can nor should try to fight every fight, but the history of this century warns us that problems abroad, if left unattended, will all too often come home to America. We have a strong interest in acting where we can to prevent disagreements in key regions from becoming conflicts and in containing conflicts before they become all-out wars. At the same time, except in extreme cases, America cannot go it alone. More often than not, the American role should be that of energizer or coalition builder, or perhaps we will provide limited amounts of specialized assistance. But if global standards are to be enforced and international stability maintained, many nations, not just the United States, have indispensable parts to fill. A third area in which we use force and diplomacy to protect American interests is in response to what Secretary Cohen has called the grave new world of terror. Because we are the world's strongest democracy, potential enemies may try to attack us by unconventional means, including terrorist strikes and the possible use of chemical and biological weapons. In countering these threats, we must be prepared at home and overseas, and that is why we are taking strong security measures and, at President Clinton's direction, improving our planning for emergency response. Through our diplomacy, we help train friendly governments in counterterrorism, offer rewards for terrorist suspects, and gather information to advise and warn Americans. We strive to forge international agreements that will leave terrorists with no place to run, no place to hide, no place to operate, and no place to keep their assets. And we do all we can to bring suspected terrorists to the bar of justice, as we have in several major cases, including the sabotage of Pan Am 103 and the bombing last summer of the 2 American embassies in Africa. Above all, we make it clear to terrorists that their efforts to make America abandon its responsibilities will never succeed. The nation whose finest raised the flag at Iwo Jima and plunged into hell on Omaha Beach will not be intimidated. Old Glory will continue to fly wherever we have interests to defend. We will meet our commitments. We will do all we can to protect our people, and we will wage the struggle against terrorism on every front, on every continent, with every tool, every day. Before closing, I want to say just a few words about the need to back up our national security leadership with resources. Over the past 5 years, the funds we annually invest in international affairs have declined by roughly 20% from the prior 5-year period. Unfortunately, the world is not 20% smaller or 20% less dangerous. And what has been a very bad situation is now at risk of becoming much worse. Last week, Congress voted to slash President Clinton's fiscal year 2000 budget request by $2 billion. The result of this bill, if it were to become law, would be to cut foreign affairs resources below even their current inadequate levels. And this would create a clear and present danger to American interests, which is why President Clinton has vowed to veto the bill. The proposed reductions do not even include another $2.6 billion in emergency needs that we have identified since the President's budget was prepared. The result is a potential shortfall of such size that it would be nearly impossible for me to do my job, and I think Secretary Cohen agrees, much harder for him to do his. And let us be clear what we're talking about. Most of the funds we spend on international affairs cannot fairly be called foreign aid. They aid America. When we provide resources to safeguard nuclear materials in the former Soviet Union or help American farmers find alternatives to growing coca or train foreign police in counterterrorism, we are aiding America. When we take steps to keep regional disputes from exploding into conflicts that would require the presence of U.S. troops, we aid America. When we negotiate trade agreements that open overseas markets to Maine seafood, paper products, or high technology, we are helping America. When our visa offices enable 6 million foreign tourists and other travelers to visit the United States annually while keeping known criminals out, we help and protect Americans. And even when we assist other countries in meeting such needs as clearing landmines, caring for refugees, and fighting HIV/AIDS, we are serving America's long-term interests and staying true to America's permanent values. And taken together, our international programs help make our citizens safer, our economy stronger, our world more stable, and our freedoms more secure. Now, many Americans are surprised when I tell them the amount we allocate to foreign affairs is equal not to a quarter or a dime or even a nickel, but only about 1 penny of every dollar the federal government spends. Let me repeat that. 1 penny out of every dollar goes to foreign affairs budget. But that penny can spell the difference between hard times and good times for our people, war and peace for our country, less and more freedom for our world. The budget debate in Washington revolves around real issues that relate to the role of the federal government in such matters as education and health care. But the protection of national security is one of our government's most basic tasks. It is a centerpiece of our Constitution and why our country first came together. It can't be delegated or subcontracted or privatized or left for others to do. It is the solemn responsibility of the executive and legislative branches in Washington, each according to its role. The best leaders of both parties in Congress understand this, and they know that American diplomacy belongs on the short list of budget priorities. This was the case President Clinton recently made in Missouri to the applause of American veterans of foreign wars, and it should be a starting point in negotiations on the final shape of the fiscal year 2000 budget. I hope we will have your support in assuring that America has the resources it requires to lead in a way our citizens expect and our interests demand. Members of the University of Maine community, we live in a world of astonishing and ever-accelerating change, where technological breakthroughs occur daily. Trends may disappear in a week, and events of just a few years ago can seem like ancient history. But some things have not changed. The wonderful taste of Maine lobster, the beauty of a New England autumn, the excellence of this university, the legacy of Ed Muskie, the integrity of Bill Cohen, and the purpose of America. Some decades ago, when Cold War tensions were at their highest, Walter Lippmann wrote about the realities of his time in words that may serve as a warning to ours. With all the danger and worry it causes, the Soviet challenge may yet prove a blessing, for if our influence were undisputed, we would, I feel sure, slowly deteriorate. Having lost our great energy and daring because everything was so comfortable, he wrote, we would enter into the decline which has marked so many societies when they have come to think there is no great work to be done. For then the night has come, and they doze off, and they begin to die. Our challenge is to prove Lippmann wrong, to employ our energy, retain our daring, and understand that our responsibilities are similar in magnitude, if not so obviously in drama, as those fulfilled by our predecessors. It is true we face no Hitler or Stalin, but it is a great mission to create the conditions under which such evil does not again threaten us, as it would be to oppose such evil if and when it did. The novelist Herman Melville wrote that we Americans are the pioneers of the world, the advance guard set on through the wilderness of untried things to make a path in the new world that is ours. The era of covered wagons and the blazing of trails through the wilderness is long past, but for America, there are no final frontiers. We are not and never have been a status quo country. We have always believed that the future can be made better than the past. We are doers. And if we are to build for our children the future they deserve, we must be more than spectators, more even than actors. We must be the authors of the history of our age. And to that mission this morning, I pledge my own best efforts and respectfully solicit yours. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks, those insightful and inspiring remarks, Secretary Albright. Now that we have you back at the podium, we'd like to take the opportunity to engage in a question and answer session with the audience. Questions were written and submitted on cards that were distributed to the audience prior to the start of today's program. Ushers have been collecting those cards throughout the speech. To present the questions, we have asked Chris Miller to assist us. Chris is a doctoral student in physics and astronomy. He currently serves as president of the University of Maine Association of Graduate Students. Chris, all yours.
Thank you very much, President Hoff. Good morning, Secretary Albright. Good morning, Secretary Cohen. If there are no objections, I will begin with some questions from the audience. For Secretary Albright, what is the likely impact on the Cohen Pakistan and on the stability in the region? What is the likely impact on the Cohen Pakistan and the stability in the region?
Well, first of all, let me say that the region itself obviously has been of great concern to us in the last months, couple of years, because of the nuclear testing and explosions that have taken place there. We have lived through a time, as we all know, where the Soviet Union and the United States had thousands of missiles pointed at each other, but we were separated by thousands of miles. Here you have two countries who have a cause, that is, fighting over the issue of Kashmir, who are now cheek by jowl, and both of them are nuclear potential. So that has been a concern already. With the military takeover in Pakistan, it creates a new level of uncertainty. The Indians have gone on military alert also, and what we hope very much is that there is a return to a constitutional system in Pakistan, and that we are able to continue the work that we have been doing of trying to deflect the conflict, trying to get India and Pakistan to talk again about how to solve Kashmir peacefully, and we would like them to sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
Also, Secretary Albright, as a role model for women today, what experiences would you recommend for a young woman to prepare them for the future leadership roles in America?
Well, you definitely have to start international relations clubs. But I also do believe very strongly, as the mother of 3 daughters, that what one has to do is obviously to be prepared for anything, to have a good college education, and to be flexible. I think the world is open to young and old women, and that they really have all just been waiting for us, right, Bill?
Again, Secretary Albright, what is the...
Shuffle the cards.
What is the administration doing to help former Maine Senator Mitchell keep the peace process alive in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think Senator Mitchell is helping us. Senator Mitchell has done a really remarkable job, I think, in having worked painstakingly to bring the Irish parties together. He is in very close touch with all of us in the administration. He speaks to the president on a regular basis. And what we are doing is obviously urging both parties to try to resolve their differences. At the same time, we're trying to help economically so that there is some sense that a peace process there will bring a peace dividend to the people.
This one's up for grabs. The United States was a powerful force in the bombing of Kosovo. What are we doing to rebuild the country of Kosovo?
First, let me say I lost my bet. Jacob, thank you for remaining quiet throughout the presentation. And let me, before answering, also say a word of tribute to all of you who are here. There was some discussion on the plane on the way up as to whether we were going back to Ohio State, as Secretary Albright and I did a couple of years ago. But that is a major difference between an audience here and the one there. I know that there are students and perhaps some faculty members or others, just community people, who may disagree with some of the policies that both Secretary Albright and I may articulate or carry out. But I must say it is with great civility that we always see at an audience here at Maine. So I want to thank you on behalf of Secretary Albright and myself. With respect to Kosovo, we have been successful in the mission that was set out. Number one, we had a choice. We could have sat in the sidelines and done nothing, in which case we would have witnessed ethnic cleansing that the Secretary talked about. Ethnic cleansing meaning just eliminating an entire people because of their religion or their race. And that has not been done since World War II. And we could have sat on the sidelines and remained indifferent, but I think that we would have sacrificed certainly our ideals. We also would have compromised our interests because of the instability of several 100,000, maybe 1 million, as was the case, of refugees overflooding surrounding states, causing great instability to those countries, possibly drawing in Turkey and Greece because of their own conflicting loyalties to different peoples. All of that was at stake, and so we had a stake in taking part. We achieved our goal. We got Milosevic to stop the killing. We allowed the refugees to come back. There is an international peacekeeping force that is now led by NATO, and Kosovo is on the way to establishing its own self-governance. What are we doing? We're contributing to the rebuilding. The bulk of that will be borne by the Europeans. The Europeans have indicated they now have roughly 85% of the forces on the ground in terms of keeping the peace in Kosovo. They also have indicated that they will bear the bulk of the responsibility for the rebuilding of Kosovo itself. The United States will participate, but will be in a supportive role rather than the one who is in the forefront of it.
Again, Secretary Cohen, what do you perceive is NATO's role in the coming 21st century?
NATO's role is twofold. Number one, it has its so-called Article 5 obligations, namely to protect the collective interests of the NATO members. We now have 19 democracies who are members of NATO. We've gone from 16 to 19, and there are many more who are knocking on the door. And we have said the door is always open. The door is open, but that door that is open stands at the top of a very steep set of stairs. Countries who wish to enter NATO must do a number of things: reforming their economies, reforming their militaries, subordinating their militaries to civilian control, promoting and establishing democracy. They must be contributors to the collective security of all the other NATO members before they are allowed to really qualify for admission. So all of that must take place for other members. So collective defense remains key. But secondly, there is the issue of how do we protect ourselves against instability on the borders? What happens if there is a chemical or biological attack by a group of terrorists? And so we have learned through the experience in Bosnia, now in Kosovo, there can in fact be contingencies which will affect the stability and the security of the NATO members, which do not involve a direct assault such as that was posed by the former Soviet Union, that we have to also be concerned with. So we have a new strategic concept that deals with the kind of contingencies, instabilities, ethnic cleansing activities that would threaten the stability of NATO members itself.
Secretary Albright, there are those who have said that some of the foreign policy has been reactionary as opposed to proactive. Would you disagree with a statement like that? And if you do, could you cite some examples where our foreign policy has been proactive but hasn't been published in the press as much as it should have?
I obviously disagree, right? Let me just say, I think that I stated what I felt were our long-term goals in terms of foreign policy, which is basically to try to have more democracies in the world because we feel more comfortable with democracies. They don't go to war with each other. And to have more free market economies because we believe that is the way that more people can be assisted and the globalization process continues. And to try to integrate those countries into some kind of an international system. Easier said than done, because what you have now are over 186 countries in the United Nations, and all of whom do not have exactly the same views, nor do we have, as I mentioned in my remarks, one single enemy, which makes it very simple to focus everyone. Clearly, there are some issues in which one has to react because another country has acted and it is up to us to take an action. On the other hand, our longer-term goal, which are encompassed in the remarks that I've made, include where we are quite proactive. I mentioned, for instance, we are being asked to do something that no nation has ever been asked to do, which is, as a superpower, to manage or help manage the devolution of its former adversary and make a partner out of it. So our activities with Russia are very proactive, I would say, in terms of working on the nuclear issues, assisting and helping them into a democratic transition. I actually believe in many ways that our policy towards Europe has been proactive. We decided to expand NATO, and Secretary Cohen has spoken about that, and we have a longer-term goal of integrating the Balkans into Europe in a way that they will be like the rest of Europe, not the missing piece of a Europe that is whole and free. We have a proactive policy as far as Asia is concerned, where we have been working on defense guidelines with the Japanese, developing a different relationship with the Chinese, the Koreans. So I could go on as a former professor for 50 minutes, but I won't.
As a professor, this question is appropriate for you as well, and also the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen. Civilian control of the military would seem to demand that citizens be able to make educated decisions when they work on matters affecting defense. What recommendations do you have for the teachers in the audience for educating their students for this responsibility of citizenship?
Well, let me say, thank you for that question, actually, because I think that one of the hardest parts at this moment is to keep people focused on international affairs and to be able to ask the kinds of questions about whether we're spending the right amount of money or whether our military is directed into the right areas. I think that people ought to, I used to teach foreign affairs, international relations, and I think that the important point here is to try to make it as relevant to the daily lives as possible, not something that is kind of out there. And we are working at the State Department, frankly, to provide very specific examples of where foreign policy affects each American. When I taught, I said it was the duty of foreign policy. The role of a foreign policy is basically to make other nations do what you want. That's what we're paid to do. It depends on a functioning global economy and a community that allows people to participate generally in the international system. If I were teaching today, what I would do is more and more point out that foreign policy isn't just about nuclear missiles. It is about day-to-day life issues that affect every single American, and that there really is not such a distinction between foreign and domestic policy, but that it's a spectrum.
I would just like to add a couple of words about the military when you ask about civilian control of the military. And I would like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the military that you have. First of all, they're from you. They are of you. These young men and women who are serving, I think we fail to fully appreciate what they go through on our behalf. I have traveled out to the deserts in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in 130-degree temperatures. I've been on our aircraft carriers in the Gulf where the temperature combined heat and humidity is 150 degrees. And they are out there carrying out their mission with great pride and joy. And we should be enormously proud of the people who are making the sacrifice so we can enjoy all the freedoms that we have. And I think as a result of what has taken place over the last couple of decades, we've seen the reduction of the threat. We've had to reduce our armed forces accordingly, so we have a smaller force, but they're being deployed more and more, putting great strain, not only on them, but their families, who may not see them for 6 months at a time while they're out on the front lines worrying about whether or not they'll have to confront a chemical weapon or biological weapon environment. So what my job is, and that of my wife, Janet, we've been trying to reconnect America with its military, because our military happens in this country to have the highest of respect. The most respected institution in the United States is the military. And let me tell you, from my travels all around the world several times, that every other country looks to us with great admiration, and some with great envy, because they look at the quality of the people that we have, how well trained they are, how well equipped they are, how educated they are, how patriotic, how dedicated. And they say, this is a country whose side I want to be on. Or this is a country whose military I don't want to take on. That's how we shape events to our own interest, because we depend upon the sword as well as the olive branch, as well as diplomacy to back up our policies. But we depend upon these young people to carry out our goals. And I must tell you that when it comes time for civilian control, there is no question about it. When tragedy strikes in North Carolina, environmental catastrophe, we've got hurricanes whipping through, who are the first people that are called upon? National Guard to come out and help. And so they turn to the military because of the discipline, because of the expertise, because of the assistance the military, in fact, can deliver. And so I must tell you, I take this responsibility that I have as not only the greatest challenge, but the greatest possible reward that anyone could have in public service is to be able to say, we've got the finest military, it's backing up the finest diplomacy, and we should be very proud of having civilian control over the best military in the world.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much, Chris. Nice job, and thanks to everybody who submitted questions. They were good ones. Secretary Albright, Secretary Cohen, thank you so much for your comments today and for your participation in this event. Some of our guests walking in may have noticed a plaque on display in the lobby. That plaque normally hangs next door in the Donald P. Corbett Business Building, the home of the William S. Cohen Center and our College of Business, Public Policy, and Health. The plaque is part of a permanent display featuring the guest lecturers who have participated in the Cohen Lecture series. Last year, we added Secretary Cohen's name as our inaugural speaker. Secretary Albright, today we are proud and honored to add your name to that plaque. We have a few things for you. The plaque stays in Orono, but we do have a few gifts for both of you to take back to Washington. First, we are pleased to present you with a biography of one of Maine's best-known public figures, former Senator Margaret Chase Smith. The biography was written by Patricia Schmidt and was recently published by the University of Maine Press. We hope you both enjoy it. Your staffs also reminded us of your mutual interest in college sports. Secretary Albright, we understand you have become familiar with our highly successful women's basketball team. So in addition to the biography, we'd like for you to have another memento of today's event. Eric? Okay. Secretary Cohen, your interest in college athletics is well known as a college basketball player yourself. You were a great example of the scholar athlete. Your staff has informed us that you are also particularly fond of our men's ice hockey team, and we appreciate your remarks this morning. We'll give that to Sean Walsh and his team as some encouragement. They are, as we all know, the defending national champions. We are pleased to provide you, Secretary Cohen, with a gift in recognition of that interest. Once again, Secretary Albright and Secretary Cohen, thank you both for your marvelous participation in this memorable event. To those in the audience and those watching or listening at home, thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.
I have to say this slide.